So far, we've talked about the stuff you can do in Breath of the Wild, how you can go about doing it, and even how pretty it is when you do it, but now it's time to talk about the more tangible stuff, the actual check them off a list kind of goals the game puts in front of you. In basically all previous Zeldas, the main attraction has been that Zelda staple, the dungeon. This game does have a handful of what you could describe as more traditional dungeons, but the main attraction they are not. This time it's all about shrines, which are basically mini dungeons, micro dungeons even. I was a little skeptical of this whole idea until I saw just how many they put in the game. There are 120 of the things spread throughout Hyrule, and I believe this is a stroke of very genius game design. If in the past you were either working your way through a dungeon or navigating a forest or a mountain or something with very little overlap, now those separate kind of dungeon and overworld experiences switch back and forth very regularly. This keeps the experience fresh, and considering the rewards you get for completing shrines, they keep you constantly moving forward and pushing into new territory, always scanning the horizon for those little glowing blobs and looking for secrets wherever you go. And I won't go back into how they feed into the game's exploration and progression system, I've covered that plenty in other sections, but suffice it to say, with such a huge world, it's great to have so many shrines because there's just always something to do. These shrines were put in place by the Sheikah a super long time ago, and they were built to test the hero, or a hero, or who even knows at this point. They were made for you, and this is really excellent from a flavor and world building standpoint. See, most dungeons in past games were real places within their respective worlds. Spiritual temples, mines, prisons, anything. The fact that they were cleverly designed and filled with puzzles rarely made sense in terms of realism. These dungeons were really just dungeons so that the player would have something to do. That's video games. There's no real reason why there would be a series of block and switch puzzles in a sacred burial temple other than it's fun. But shrines are way different. First off, from a feel perspective, it's just awesome how they're inside of these massive underground spaces that are just way bigger than they need to be. They're so far down that you feel like you've been transported to another world, and it's cool to think about how all these shrines have existed for who even knows how many years, and the people of Hyrule have just been walking around up on the surface with no idea of the craziness going on under their feet. Also, the fact that these shrines were created to test the hero means that they make more sense within the world than previous dungeons have. These contraptions and puzzles don't need a reason to exist. They can be whatever they want to be and still make perfect sense. I know this is a pretty small detail that your average person probably won't care about, but you know me, I'm all about feel, and I think this is great. I will absolutely admit, though, that most important is how this impacts the game from a design perspective. The man-made, hero-tailored nature of these shrines had a massive effect on how puzzles were crafted here. The existence of these shrines is more logical than previous dungeons, yet their artificial nature frees them from being shackled to the logic of any individual location. Even if block and switch puzzles don't technically make a ton of sense being in a sacred burial temple, they still have to fit within the confines of the temple and mesh with the theme of the temple. All of this temple's puzzles have to kind of fit together. They have to make sense within the location, and they very often have to be built around whatever important item you get there. Shrines, on the other hand, can be whatever they want. They can be as big as they want. They can be super tall or super long. They can build into any direction at any time, and theme and logic be darned. They can feature whatever giant, ridiculous contraptions the dev team could possibly dream up. Again, this is excellent on a flavor level because it makes for these bizarre setups that can feel really dangerous and intimidating. But as always, more important is the freedom of design. If you can think it up, it could fit into one of these shrines. It can chomp, it can stomp, it can shock, it can burn, it can swing, it can launch, it can attack. It is absolutely wonderful, not knowing exactly what to expect when you head down into a shrine. You may run into a mechanic that you've never seen before. You may have to use your runes in a way that you never considered. You may have to fight a guy, or lots of little guys, or fight no guys at all and just do puzzles. Some shrines contain a tiny handful of puzzles in 1 or 2 rooms, and some seem to go on for ages, really living up to that mini dungeon descriptor. These latter ones are particularly delightful. There are so many small shrines that it's always really refreshing to stay engaged with one for a good long while. Naturally, the freedom of design we see in these shrines is thanks in very large part to Breath of the Wild's physics system and the runes we've been given to utilize it. A lot of the puzzles in this game are very unlike the puzzles in previous games. Previously, there were a lot more tightly designed head-scratcher kind of puzzles. Sliding blocks, torches, pattern memorization, that kind of thing. Breath of the Wild does have a fair amount of that, but it way more often employs a somewhat relaxed design. You've got a goal, and you've got all your runes to try and figure out how to achieve that goal. There are often multiple ways to go about completing a puzzle, and it's always interesting to watch other people play and see how their thought processes often differ greatly from my own. Let's take a moment to talk about each rune and how they affect the puzzling. everything. Magnesis is easily the most versatile. As is the case with many of the game's mechanics, it's slightly surprising to me that the dev team was willing to give us an ability that offered so much freedom. Magnesis doesn't just let you pick up metal objects or push them and pull them or something, it lets you manipulate them fully, moving them around within a giant 3D space, no matter how big they are. This opens up limitless interactions and allows for very complex puzzling, especially considering just how many objects in this world are made of metal. Its impact on the puzzle design and the overall experience seriously cannot be overstated. Stasis gets the award for biggest game breaker. Just about anything that moves can be frozen, smacked around, then launched at crazy speeds. Again, no matter how big it is. This mechanic brings a freedom to the table that is much more creative in nature. If you're gonna dream up some really wacky way to solve a problem, chances are it's gonna feature stasis heavily. It's especially fun because you can control the speed and direction of the object you're stasising, and it's a really tricky thing, but launching some giant object and having it land right where you need it to, like you're chucking a baseball or a golf ball or something, is extremely satisfying. Cryonis is very much a utility rune. It's not showy and game-breaking like Magnesis and Stasis, but it can still be extremely useful. The blocks it creates can be used to lift platforms, guide rolling balls, boost you up to high places, or even push things out of place. I especially enjoy Cryonis-heavy puzzles because they tend to be a little more traditional. Having many places to put blocks, but trying to figure out exactly which 3 places should get one is a ton of fun. Lastly, you've got bombs. They ain't the most nuanced rune in your tool belt, but when is an explosion ever not useful? Bombs have always been useful in Zelda games, but here they're made even more so by 1, offering both rolling and non-rolling varieties, and 2, providing remote detonation. Both of these features are positively genius because they increase puzzle application tenfold. Bombs also combine beautifully with stasis as they can be used to give a frozen object a ton of momentum before it gets blasted off. In fact, all of the runes interact with each other in fun and crazy ways. Each one opens up so many puzzling possibilities that what we end up with in Breath of the Wild is a seemingly endless supply of super interesting physics-based puzzles that can be particularly satisfying to solve. When there appear to be multiple ways to solve a problem, coming up with your own solution can feel incredibly rewarding. Like, instead of just figuring out exactly what you were supposed to figure out, jumping through just the right hoop and getting the answer, you invented a way to do what you wanted to do. It uses a very different part of the brain, I think. Much like with the difficult combat, it can make you feel like you really did something cool on your own. It feels much more like you earn your victory. Breath of the Wild shrine puzzles are really fun, but naturally I have a couple complaints. Sometimes I do find myself wishing we were given more traditional puzzles. Rolling giant stone balls and flinging around metal boxes and manipulating all these crazy ramps and things is tons of fun, but every once in a while I'm just like, you know, I could really go for a sliding block puzzle right about now. As we've seen with some other parts of the game, I love this new style, but I do sometimes miss the old style a little, and I hope that future games offer more of a balance between the two. A bigger issue is difficulty. There are indeed some tricky puzzles in this game, don't get me wrong, but I think just a few too many are a smidge too easy. Like the solution is painfully obvious. Sometimes you'll even have these big crazy setups and you can tell that there are probably 100 different ways you can solve a puzzle, but then it's like, or I could just put one ice block right here and it's done. And you solve it in like 10 seconds. I suppose that's the price that comes with open-ended puzzles. You'll often find the weakest end and exploit it without much effort. I understand that accessibility is a big thing for Nintendo, but maybe just a few more extra tricky ones sprinkled in would have helped a lot. Fortunately though, I will say that the unique nature of these puzzles means that even the easy ones can still be pretty darn fun. Freezing just the right thing with just the right timing and launching something where it's supposed to go or whatever you're supposed to do just feels good, even if it only takes you one try to pull off. Well, that's all there is to talk about when it comes to shrine puzzles. I guess we can move on to, oh no, I had just blocked gyro puzzles from my memory. Don't remind me that they exist. You want to know what I think about Breath of the Wild's gyro puzzles? You want my detailed analytical critique on them? They're awful. They're miserable and awful, and I hate them. You ever heard the phrase, Nintendo got a Nintendo? It's the idea that no matter how awesome a Nintendo game or product is, they've got this weird knack for including at least one little completely baffling thing that brings down the experience for no good reason. Gyro puzzles are this game's Nintendo just being Nintendo thing. The basic idea of tilting your controller or your Switch to roll some balls around or whatever is fine. I guess that could be a little fun. But most often, to do what you want to do, you've got to keep tilting and tilting and tilting, and it's not long before you reach a point where there's no possible human way to tell what movements will translate into what actions on screen, and you gotta just start the whole thing over or twist around randomly until you win by sheer stupid luck. The puzzles are tedious, the tracking is inaccurate, and trying to do any of it in handheld mode is a complete nightmare. I could probably complain about gyro puzzles for 10 minutes if you let me, so instead I'm just gonna stop here and say, what on earth were they thinking with this? Whoever approved these puzzles needs a stern talking to. Shrines may make up the bulk of Breath of the Wild's dungeoniness, definitely a real word, but it does, very fortunately, feature a handful of actual dungeons. You've got 4 divine beasts to liberate, and each one acts as its own self-contained dungeon. They leave a good amount to be desired, but they also do a lot of stuff very, very right. So let's start with the good stuff. From a flavor standpoint, these are probably the coolest dungeons in any Zelda game ever. I mean, come on, they're 4 gigantic, roving, robotic beasts that are so big you can see them from across the map. And yet they're dungeons. After an endless stream of sacred temples and lava caves and twisty tree places, these are an amazing breath of fresh air. They're just impossibly cool, and not the sort of thing I would have ever expected to see hanging around Hyrule. Then I love how each one requires a fun little chase kind of sequence in order to actually board them. These sequences are so unique within the game that it's a shame they're over so fast. They're these little bursts of excitement in my memory, and I'm always bummed that I would have to start up a whole new file if I wanted to experience them again. Makes me feel like the game could really use more of these fast-paced sequences, you know? Perhaps if they use the idea of latching onto roving enemies I presented in the previous section, or just sequences that require a horse, or take place way up in the sky with your paraglider, chasing monsters and hitting their weak points and stuff while you're zipping around everywhere. Just a thought, moving on. Once you're actually on board a divine beast, the dungeoniness truly begins. As is the case with shrines, the puzzles on display are generally quite terrific. In fact, since each divine beast has something of a theme, I would say that the puzzles here are some of the best. As I've said, I love how free and wacky shrine puzzles can be. That makes for very fresh experiences, but there is still something to be said about having a little more focus and having puzzles that link together to form a longer experience. The absolute best part about the divine beast, though, is that each one gives you a special command to manipulate it in some unique way. Generally, this involves moving huge parts of the beast around, and not only is this kind of dungeon-wide manipulation just plain cool, but it opens up really unique new design opportunities. The different ways you can move things around and how that affects the dungeon's puzzles and how you move through the dungeons, it's all exceedingly clever. The divine beasts offer up some of the most cohesive, interesting design we've seen in any Zelda dungeons ever. On the negative side, though, they're just too short. They're kind of like the fast-paced sequences that precede each one. They're great, but they're over so fast that they take up a really tiny chunk of your total time with the game, which can make them feel a little insignificant. Adding to this problem is the fact that each one contains very little fighting. Dungeons of old were a mix of puzzles and monster killing, but the divine beasts tend to only contain little handfuls of guardian scouts and blobby bubble skull guys that come out of the gross Ganon goop. It's really mostly about the puzzles, so there's always that little part of me that feels like something's missing from the experience. I guess I've just been conditioned to expect certain things from my Zelda dungeons. Then to top it all off, you've got something of a lack of individual identity. Each beast does have its own shape and manipulation mechanic and even its own puzzle themes, but none of these themes are as strong as those in past dungeons, at least not artistically. A fire cave might just be another fire cave, kind of boring, but when you're in a fire cave, you know you're in a fire cave. That's a very strong visual and thematic identity. Same with a crumbling ruin or a twisty spider-infested tree or the snowy remains of a castle up on a mountain. These divine beasts are really unique and cool, but when you hold them all up to one another, they feel awfully similar. When I look back on them, they have less of a presence in my memory, if that makes sense. They could almost all just be one big dungeon. The funny thing about these negatives, though, is that I can't count them all as completely negative. When it comes to something that's been done so many times over the years, I can really appreciate big changes like these. Even the less than perfect elements can be forgiven because of just how different this experience is. I do wish these dungeons were longer, but it's also kind of nice to not have to dedicate myself to finishing a massive, complicated dungeon before I can feel comfortable shutting the game off. I miss having more monsters to fight with mini-bosses and all that, but the greater focus on puzzles is also kind of relaxing. The divine beasts don't have a ton of visual identity when compared to each other, but the identity that they share is already so unique that I don't mind as much. Despite their shortcomings, I can very much say that I enjoyed the heck out of the Divine Beasts, and I hope a lot of the ideas they brought to the table are carried forward into future Zelda titles. We ain't quite done with Divine Beasts though. Zelda dungeons wouldn't be Zelda dungeons without bosses, and as such, there's a big mean boss waiting at the end of each beast. And just like the beasts themselves, these bosses are great in ways, but also have some shortcomings. In fact, it's funny, I'm pretty torn on almost every aspect. First, each blight is a nasty little mini incarnation of Ganon. You got Thunderblight Ganon, Waterblight Ganon, etc. As with the dungeons, these lack a very strong visual identity when they're all held up to each other, versus a giant spider, or a dragon, or a ghost, or some other thing we tend to see in Zelda games. But I can really appreciate how different the core idea of them is. I mean, they're really cool looking, even if they all look kind of similar to each other. They're super gross and scary, and they embody Ganon in a very new monster-like way that is not necessarily pig-like. Mechanically, they're designed much like the game's other enemies. They do have some specific weaknesses that you can exploit, but you can also just plain old do damage to them by hitting them with swords and arrows and stuff. And actually, that's probably the biggest problem right there. I can appreciate how open-ended the fights are. It's not the same use the right item and open their weak spot thing that we've seen 1,000 times, and if you really purposefully hit these bosses early, I'm sure you'd be in for a good challenge. But the way I play this game, it makes for disappointingly easy boss fights. As far as I can tell, these blights just don't scale. By the time I got to each one, I was powerful enough to make short work of it. The Gerudo one was the trickiest for sure, though not so much with all of my champion abilities and infinite healing items, and I was still fairly weak when I fought the Zora one since it was so early in the game, but for the most part, no. The game was like, you can fly around on the gusts and deflect its beam and shoot back the ice blocks, and I'm like, or I could just shoot him in the eye and wail on him until he's dead. In my eyes, bosses are some of the best and most memorable things in any Zelda game, so this is more than a little disappointing. You could easily argue that many past bosses have been laughably easy as well, and in fact significantly more so, and you would be 100% correct. But I just think if any game in the whole series was equipped to offer particularly good and challenging boss battles, it should have been Breath of the Wild. It's the wasted potential that's the problem. One more specific gripe about the Divine Beasts before we move on is that the game naturally pushes you to the Zora one first. I'm willing to bet that the majority of players do it before anything else. And this whole section of the game sets the bar really high in terms of what you need to do to access a Divine Beast. Vah Ruta is spraying loads of water into the air, creating perpetual rain in the mountain range that comprises Zora's domain. Since you can't climb in the rain, you've got to get all the way up the mountains on foot, and it's really challenging because the place is just lousy with shock arrow shooting Lizalfos. When you finally get up, you're rewarded with armor that lets you swim up waterfalls, which you just get to keep forever, and you have to use this to climb up Ploymus Mountain and either fight the Lionel up there or steal shock arrows from him so that you can use them to board Vah Ruta. It's this long and very fun sequence, and it makes the short length of the Divine Beast much easier to swallow. I don't know about you, but I was really excited to see what kinds of cool quests I had to go on to get on the other Divine Beasts, and what neato traversal abilities they might grant me as rewards. And of course, I was progressively more disappointed with each one I found. None of them can hold a candle to Vah Ruta. I mean, with Vah Medo, you go to Rito Village and they're like, go find Rivali, I think he's out getting lunch or something. So you walk over and find him and do like the easiest target test in the universe, and he's like, all right, let's go. And you fly up and do your thing and you're done. Vah Rudania is a little better. There are a couple things you gotta do, and you gotta figure out how to get up on Death Mountain without catching on fire, so yeah. Vah Naboris does indeed have a longer, more in-depth quest that you've got to do, but I wasn't too thrilled by it, and I'll actually talk about that more in a bit. Basically, the rest of the Divine Beast lead-ups are just bummers. I can deal with some being more cool and in-depth than others, but the fact that the very best one is basically thrown at you right at the start of the game raises expectations and ultimately leads to something of a letdown. So overall, there's a lot to like about the way Breath of the Wild does dungeons through both shrines and Divine Beasts, but there's a lot of room for improvement as well. The funny thing is that the biggest complaint you usually hear is that it feels like there's just not a lot of dungeon to go around versus the more traditional dungeon format of past games. But when you really think about it, is that true? There are 120 shrines in the game. 29 of them are blessings, which means the challenge comes from opening them up, and once you get inside, there's nothing to do but grab your prize and go, so okay, let's say 91 shrines. What's like the shortest time it takes to do an easy shrine? 5 minutes, maybe? So even at that low end, you're looking at 7.5 hours of shrineage, and we all know that some of them take way longer than 5 minutes to beat. Some are extra tricky and take a lot of puzzling out, and some are just long. I think 20 plus hours of working through through shrines in total is a reasonable estimate. And sure, you don't have to do them all to beat the game, but if you're lamenting that there's not enough dungeon in this game, you're probably one of those people who is hunting down all of the shrines. Then, on top of all the shrines, you've got the 4 main dungeons. Sure, they're not the longest dungeons, but they're not the shortest either. I mean, Majora's Mask only had 4 main dungeons, and Wind Waker had like, I don't know, 2? 2 or something? I don't remember. These ones are a little short, but they're not insignificantly so. So altogether, I'd say there's a decent amount of dungeoniness in this game. So the interesting thing to think about is, why does it not feel that way? Because I kind of feel like it's lacking in dungeons too, if I'm honest, and I don't get why. My theory is that breaking the dungeon experience up into many smaller experiences makes it all feel a little less substantial in the end. No individual thing holds a giant place in your memory, so it kind of feels like you didn't get to do as much. None of the dungeony experiences have a very strong visual and thematic identity, as we talked about, so they all kind of run together and none of them are particularly memorable, even if they are still really fun. I'm not one of those people who was like super disappointed by Breath of the Wild's lack of more traditional dungeons, but as with many things, I do hope they can strike a better balance in the future. This was kind of nice for a change, but let's have some more striking and in-depth dungeons next time, even if it is still just a handful of them plus a whole bunch of shrines. Because for the record, I never want another Zelda game without a whole bunch of shrines. Before we move on from dungeons though, let's touch on 2 notable places in Hyrule that are sort of like dungeons, even though they're kind of not, but they're not like anything else in the game, so I kind of lump them into the dungeon category. The first is the hideout of the Yiga clan. Here you've got to venture deep into a canyon in Gerudo Desert and retrieve a Thunder Helm so you can board Va Naboris. I liked the thrill of visiting the hideout of the guys who had been trying to kill me the whole game. I like that this is a fairly large and unique area that's only used for this one quest, as we don't have a ton of those in Breath of the Wild. I like the silly little thing the Yiga Blade Masters do when they see bananas. Beyond those things, there is not much to like about this quest. This is the kind of auto-fail stealth section that I was happy to escape when I found that Breath of the Wild implemented stealth in a more natural way. When I got to the hideout and I saw that one hit from these billion HP Blade Masters would give me a game over, and that I couldn't save in the middle somewhere, I absolutely had to start all over whenever I died, I was just appalled. It doesn't really matter how strong you are. You cannot take a hit from these guys, and that flies in the face of the whole rest of the game and what it stands for. Now, I'm annoyed that I can't 100% fault it, because apparently it is indeed possible to kill all the Blade Masters and avoid having to sneak. Your reward for having the skill to take them out legitimately, or the resources to blast them all with ancient arrows, is a shorter, simpler ordeal. And hey, I'm always talking about how some challenges in this game are too easy, right? Shouldn't I be happy about this? But somehow I'm not. Really, I'm just annoyed that they would put a no-save, auto-fail section in a game that seemed to have broken free from things like that. It just seems wrong. It is cool how the place has a boss, though, even though he's, you know, too easy. The second slightly dungeony place is Hyrule Castle. It doesn't really have an end goal beyond climbing to the top and fighting Ganon and maybe finding its shrine, so at the end of the day, it's mostly just a place to explore. I'm a little torn on this, which I suppose is not surprising based on my opinions on all the other dungeons in the game. I was definitely disappointed that there wasn't more of a point to Hyrule Castle. I kept turning corners and expecting to run into something big. But when I look past that disappointment, I can really appreciate the idea of this gigantic, sprawling place that was made mostly for exploring. It's jam-packed with powerful enemies, and I spent so much of the game being too scared to even get close that finally creeping around inside and trying to find my way up to take an early peek at Ganon was a huge thrill. There is good loot to find, and that's obviously great, but most of the fun comes from just seeing the castle and how grand and beautifully constructed it is, and imagining what went down when it was destroyed 100 years ago. It's incredible that the dev team put so much effort into something that you barely have to experience if you don't want to. If you know where you're going and you just keep on climbing, you can get to the top fairly quickly, but if you're so inclined, you can spend hours exploring every nook and cranny, and you will find some decently interesting stuff if you do. I already mentioned the journals of Zelda and the King in an earlier section, but I would say another highlight is the Stalnox down in the dungeon that's guarding a Hylian shield. That's definitely one of those, whoa, I actually found something really cool moments. Also, surprise Lionel attack! Hyrule Castle may not be a full dungeon exactly, but hey, it does have a boss at the end. The final battle with Ganon is here, and we might as well talk about it. I had positively no idea what to expect when I climbed that castle for the first time. I was thinking, so is Ganon just like sitting there somewhere? Will I find Zelda hanging out with him? Am I gonna fight a giant swirly pig head? How do you fight a giant swirly pig head? How's this gonna go down? So I was surprised and thoroughly ooged out when I found a nasty Ganon cocoon pod chilling up in the tower. And I also did not expect the Ganon that came out of it to look quite like it did. We're used to the idea of Ganondorf having a regular old humanoid body, then turning into some weird pig beast when you fight him. The Ganon swirling around the castle the whole game is pig-like because he's given up his regular body and is in a crazy enraged form. So it's extra creepy to me that here he embodies his humanoid self but in a very uncanny monster-like way. I expected pure Piggy, but we got no Piggy at all. He's got a human-like face with a classically Ganondorf red beard and all these gangly human-like arms. This reflection of his original Gerudo self can also be found in the Blights, as I touched on earlier, and it's a terrifically fresh take on the villain. Even better though, Calamity Ganon's dwarfy features are made all the more creepy thanks to the rest of his design. Again, no Piggy here, even though I was sure there would be. He's more like a guardian. He's got a grotesque spider-like body. Some of his legs look like they came right from a guardian stalker. He's got ancient blades for claws, and he's even got his own laser beam arm. He's basically the ultimate guardian. And I know I've said this kind of thing about 100 times throughout this review, but seeing him for the first time, I thought, am I playing a Zelda game here? Like, is this really a Zelda game? Because this is very unlike any Zelda boss I've fought. Mechanically, I'm a little torn on this boss fight. When you just look at him and his attacks, he's the best boss in the game several times over. He's just got such a wide assortment of attacks. I've already expressed how I like the baddies in this game because you actually fight them. You, for the most part, don't just use an item to open them up like a puzzle. And Calamity Ganon is no exception. You're constantly moving, constantly dealing with some new attack or other, and deciding what specific way you want to deal damage to him. But then, just like with the Blights, if you actually played the game before you came to fight him, he's way too easy. You don't necessarily have to learn all of his attacks and figure out how to dodge them and deal damage if you just feel like spamming him with bomb arrows. On top of that, if you freed all the divine beasts, and again, who would not do that, the champions blast him down to half health before the battle even begins. When you get him down to about a quarter is when things should start to get difficult because he puts up this shield around himself, and as far as I can tell, the only good old-fashioned way to get past it is to perfectly shield parry his laser attack, and I don't know about you, but parrying lasers is hard as heck. Got your champion powers though? Don't worry about a thing. Daruk's protection parries it for you, and Urbosa's fury just breaks the shield all by itself. Mix in a heaping tablespoon of Master Sword, and you got yourself a defeated Calamity Ganon cake. I can definitely appreciate this in its own way. They want him to be easy if you played the game a bunch. That's your reward for conquering Hyrule. You get to just cruise on in there and kick his gross spidery butt. That's basically how it was in Majora's Mask. But it's just so clear that Calamity Ganon is an amazingly designed, amazingly fun boss that it's disappointing when the battle's over so quickly. You definitely can make it harder by not freeing all the divine beasts, which is something I might try in later playthroughs, but the first time was the most special time, and the memory of my first special time will always be just a little anticlimactic. Absolutely still fun though, don't get me wrong, and if anything, the weird visual design kinda made up for the low difficulty. It was still an amazingly cool fight. After you beat Calamity Ganon, you fight Dark Beast Ganon, but there isn't really much to talk about here, especially seeing as I already touched on him in the section on story. He's the standard Zelda final battle. Zelda gives you light arrows, and you ride around and shoot all his weak spots. Though actually, it is kind of unusual in how ridiculously easy it is. Most Ganon fights can still be at least a little challenging. This is very simple and by the numbers, and I don't even know if it's possible for his big laser attack to hit you. Like, can it? Have any of you guys actually been hit by that thing? But, like I said before though, I still think it's fun. I'm enough of a feel guy that I'll take something like this just to cap off the game. Some epic cinematic final sequence that exists just to be the epic cinematic final sequence. I mean, come on, look how big the guy is. Breath of the Wild wins the award for biggest Ganon ever. While we're talking about bosses again, let's take this time to touch on mini-bosses. There are 5 types of mini-boss that can be found all over the place, the exception being Molduga, which can only be found in Gerudo Desert. As with other baddies, it is a little disappointing that there isn't more variety here. I mean, there are some Zelda games with 8 or 9 dungeons, and each one has at least one mini-boss, and sometimes there are even a few outside of dungeons. But fortunately, these 5 guys all feel very grand and substantial, epic enough to feel like they could be actual dungeon bosses. Plus, for the most part, they're really fun, and I'm actually happy to fight them again and again. Zelda bosses have always been so much fun, but sometimes they're over so quickly that they're like this tiny little sliver of the greater experience. In Breath of the Wild, though, you've basically got all the mini-bosses you can possibly take on, and whether it's a hearty challenge or you're destroying them left and right, it's just something fun to do. Lynels are easily the toughest mini-boss of the bunch, and they're literally one of my favorite things about the entire game. I've talked about them quite a bit in previous sections, but I just love how challenging they can be. There are no tricks here, no items to open them up, no way to stun them beyond a very brief headshot stun that basically everybody has. These guys are about good, honest video game play-in, learning attacks, reacting quickly, protecting yourself while also dishing out damage any way you can, and that's just so refreshing. Stone taluses are really fun. I love how they've only got one weak spot, and it can be tough to reach when it's on the back instead of up on the head, as taluses love to track you and try to collapse on you when they're stunned. I love how incredibly intimidating they are early in the game. They're just gigantic, they're made of boulders, and their main rock throw attack can smush you flat in a second. Even better, you've got fire and ice versions, and without the right arrows and gear, they can be extra tough to bring down. Hinoxes stand out because they're the most interactable. They're always sleeping when you find them, so sneaking up on them is pretty exciting early on. I was amazed when I learned that you can hang out on a Hinox's hand, and after a few moments, he'll scratch his belly and lift you up, where you can rob him of all his loot without him even noticing. If you do want to fight a Hinox the old-fashioned way, and I must say, I've never come across a Hinox I didn't want to fight, you're in for a good time. You can shoot their big ol' eyes to stun them, but after taking so much damage, they'll start to cover their eyes with their hands, and trying to stun them anyway is fun. If you can't stun them, you've got to get in close to hit them, but then you run the risk of being squashed and squished and smacked. Sometimes they've got these guards on their legs, and I'm seriously clueless, because it also took me a long time to realize that you could burn off the wooden ones and shock the metal ones. Overall, there's just a lot to Hinox battles, and however you go about them, they're just fun to fight. Molduga are easily the most disappointing mini-bosses in the game. Visually, they're awesome. They're these gross, giant lizard fish monsters that swim through the sand like graboids. If you're out on the open sand, they can be really deadly. Problem is, once you find out how to kill them, they're a joke. Stand on a rock. The Molduga can never hurt you ever again. Throw a bomb, he eats it, you detonate it, smack him while he's stunned, and run back to your rock. Repeat until dead. It's probably the most traditional Zelda boss fight in the game, because it's got one major weakness that you exploit with one of your quote-unquote items. But at least past exploitable bosses have had attack phases after getting hit, and that's exactly what the Molduga needs. After you stun it and get in some hits, it needs to do something that forces you off your rock and actually makes the battle a little challenging. As it is, though, they're fairly blah. They are epic, and you can try fighting them using a sand seal for some extra excitement, but I don't really see the need to, and that's pretty lame. Finally, we come to Guardians, and I kinda lied. I said there were 5 kinds of mini-boss, even though Guardians come in a few different varieties. Stalkers are the nastiest, and really, they're the biggest bullies of Hyrule. Lynels are tough, but at least they keep to themselves, and there are weaker types to fight near the start of the game. Stalkers come in one very high-strength variety and just run around looking for little links to blast. I've already talked about how exciting they make the game, and for this reason they are also one of my favorite parts about it. They're horrifying magical robots that shoot you with an exploding laser beam. That's just crazy. Finally, getting strong enough to take one out is a very triumphant feeling, and getting strong enough to take them out easily is its own kind of satisfaction. The great thing though, even if you can usually chop off all their legs before they even get a chance to move, or jump down from somewhere and take them out with bomb arrows right to the eye before you hit the ground, get caught in a situation where they're running so fast you can't hit their eyes or reach any of their legs, you can still get blasted to smithereens. They should never be underestimated. Decayed Guardians can be found lying around some places, and I think these are really smart. They're weaker versions of Stalkers, and they're stuck in the ground, so they're easier to avoid, but they still give you a taste of that Guardian experience early in the game. It's always tempting to see if you can take one out, but if you mess up, you're gonna get blown to high heaven. Plus, you never know when one is gonna turn out to be not quite as decayed as you thought and get up and start chasing you, and that sows the kind of anxiety that I just love in games. Skywatchers are like Stalkers, but they fly around and have a more limited range of sight. You can damage their propellers to make them fall, but even then you've still got to deal with their lasers. And just like Stalkers, they can be stunned by shooting them in the eye, but panic and start missing and you're gonna have a bad time. They might not be as exciting as Stalkers, but they still add a hefty dose of fear to many of Hyrule's locales, and I love them for that. Turrets are only found guarding Hyrule Castle, and there isn't much to say about them. They stay put like Decayed Guardians, but they're tougher to beat. And hey, they got a blasty boom laser like all the other Guardians, so thumbs up. Finally, we've got the big Guardian Scouts that you fight in Test of Strength shrines, and these are actually pretty different from the other Guardians, probably because they were created exclusively to test the legendary hero. They were particularly fun to figure out because they've got a lot of attacks, and because of this, I would say they're some of the best baddies in the game. Their behavior changes the lower you get their HP, and each move they make requires a different reaction. And man, when they're charging their big laser, and none of your attacks stun them, and all you can do is wail on them and pray that you can finish them off before they open fire, that's good stuff right there. The last major thing to talk about in this whole entire review is quests. Previous games have all had quests, characters telling you to go fetch this, go do that. Majora's Mask introduced the idea of having them all in writing so that you could see what you had and hadn't done, and Breath of the Wild goes nuts with the idea. Anytime anyone wants you to do anything, it becomes a quest in your quest menu. This is excellent, obviously, because you can easily remember what you still need to do, but it's also great because it keeps track of important information about your quests so you don't need to keep re-asking people for your clues. I've mentioned before that shrine quests are the best, but let's touch on them again here. If you absolutely had to get a shrine quest from the right person before you could complete it, it would be pretty lame. The game allows you to stumble upon secret shrines on your own, which of course adds immensely to the game's sense of exploration and discovery. Again, I'd say these secret shrines with their own quests provide the most interesting and unique scenarios in the game. They're the coolest, funnest things to find when you're exploring the great big land of Hyrule. But then, if you haven't happened upon a shrine yet, but you talk to the right person about it, they can give you a nudge in the right direction if you should want one. For me, this resulted in a really great mix of finding cool shrines on my own and trying to puzzle out my active shrine quests whenever I was bored and wanted something to work on. Some of my very favorite shrine quests were Casses, because I just love riddles. Some of them were pretty easy, but a few had me scratching my head. Every time I was running around and I heard that accordion music float in from somewhere, I'd be like, oh yes, it's riddle time, baby! The only disappointing thing about shrine quests, basically any shrine where it's a challenge simply to find or access it, is that they usually end with a blessing, like I mentioned earlier. The game goes, good job, you already put in the work, so here's some treasure and your spirit orb, no puzzles needed, just sit back and relax, man. I understand why they did it this way, but puzzles. I love puzzles. 29 blessings out of 120 shrines is a whole lot of puzzling I wish I was doing. It's easier to forgive the blessings that come after crazy challenges like Eventide or the Labyrinths or whatever, but at least a handful of the blessings are pretty silly. Sometimes it only takes you like a minute to open a shrine, and it's like, come on, that was too easy to warrant a blessing. Give me some puzzles already. Beyond shrine quests, you've got regular old do this thing for me quests, and these are another mixed bag. I do really enjoy having all these quests, because if I'm in love with the mechanics and the overall experience of just playing a game, I don't care much what I'm doing in it and will jump at the chance to perform even the most menial tasks. Finding quests everywhere and having a great big list of them to tackle, I just love it. A problem, though, is that the rewards do not seem to scale with you here, and they are usually very underwhelming. It's not a huge problem because, like I said, it's fun to just do quests, but it would be nice if these people gave you stuff that was a little more helpful. I mean, you spend 10-20 minutes completing a quest and you get 100 rupees or a ruby or something? Pretty lame. Basically, most regular quests are just there for the fun of doing something and the satisfaction of checking things off a list. That's not going to appeal to everyone, but I can say it appeals to me enough to still be enjoyable. Though another thing I'll say, it's also pretty lame to get a quest that's like, can you go up the mountain and find me 3 rubies? And you're like, well, I have 300 of those, so here you go. Several quests are literally worthless if you hit them too late in the game. There are a good few quests that I found really enjoyable, but the best of the bunch just might be the Terrytown quest, for a number of reasons. It's this long series of smaller quests where you have to find people with the right kind of name, so when I first played through the game, I was always excited to reach a new town and talk to all the townsfolk. Then the quest takes a lot of wood and rupees, and it's always nice to just use up some of your ample supply of materials. The best part about it, though, is that it has you actually building a town, watching new structures go up as you find new people. Having new shops to buy from is an okay tangible reward, but much better is the feeling that you're actually doing some small thing to restore this devastated Hyrule. Not only could the game use more of these long-term multi-stage quests in general, but I think just about everyone agrees that building and restoring structures is something that would just work so well in this game. Sure, it's nice that we get to beat Ganon in the end, and we know that Zelda will work to put things back in order, But Terrytown gave me such a delicious little taste of this whole restoration idea that I was left wanting so much more. Similarly to how the game's material gathering and weapon breakage mechanics set the foundation for a crafting system that just isn't there, material gathering and the Terrytown quest, along with the ability to build your own house, set the foundation for a building system that feels like it should be obvious but is also, sadly, nowhere to be found. There seems to be a pretty common trend running through most of Breath of the Wild's quests and what you could consider dungeony content. A lot of it is really, really terrific. The vast number of shrines with all of their physics puzzles, the visually epic and mechanically unique divine beasts, many of the other quests and challenges that really imbue the world with a sense of magic or are just plain fun to do. Sprinkled throughout, there are elements that bring the experience down, and there are some disappointing missed opportunities. But when I turn my intense scrutinizing machine down a couple notches and just focus on how much fun I had a ton of fun. I absolutely loved my time working through the game's various challenges, and it's much easier to look past flaws when I'm just so happy to be doing something very fresh and new for Zelda. Maybe there will come a day when the novelty of newness wears off and I find myself bored of physics puzzles and wishing for more substantial dungeons more than anything, but after hundreds of hours in the game, I can still say that this was a good direction for Zelda's dungeons to move in. It could all use some tweaking, sure, but this new format is one that I would be more than happy to see again.